And I think the Facebook is live. Lino, would you mind doing the initial prayer? And then I can introduce Peter.
Sure.
Thank you.
So it's 7:30. So let me invite all of us to close our eyes, elevate our thoughts to Master Jesus, and ask Him for inspiration, for enlightenment, especially for our guest speaker, Peter, so that he may be inspired in the content He's planned to transfer to us today, to talk to us about today, but also to ask our Lord to have compassion and mercy on all of us in this planet in the moment of many catastrophes and many wars that are ongoing, on the geopolitical situation in all countries that we now understand to be divided and separate, that as time passes, we can understand we are all just one humanity. May the Lord bless us all, bless our friend Peter Hayes is going to speak to us now, and allow us to begin our meeting. So please.
Thank you, Lino. So hi, everyone. We have Peter Hayes here today with us. Peter has been an active member of the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey, right, for over 20 years. So it's great to have you here, Peter. The floor is yours. Thank you so much again for being here.
All righty. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. So one moment. Okay. So I'd like to thank Spiritist Society of Chicago for having me back. It is a pleasure to be here as always. There are many ways that we are responsible for our spiritual progress. And one of them is to do our best to avoid being gullible. Being gullible is something that can easily happen to many of us. And it's always a challenge sometimes to really do our best to understand the intentions of others, to use discernment before we place our trust in somebody else. And there are lots of reasons why we might become gullible. Perhaps we're vulnerable because we have low self-esteem. Perhaps we're going through a very difficult period emotionally, and that makes us vulnerable. Perhaps we're the impatient kind who want quick, straightforward answers to complicated problems, and that's that. And so we're willing to follow somebody who provides these clear, simple answers to complicated problems. Maybe we're the type that we must feel that we should be conciliatory and defer to those who are more powerful than we are, even if doing so might invite abuse. Then again, maybe we're the type that we're absolutely convinced that our point of view is correct. Maybe we are unwilling to entertain a different perspective, and we're quite happy to follow along with those who think the same way we do. Sometimes we may be, shall I say, embarrassed or afraid to admit that we're ignorant about something, and so that, in a way, is a different type of gullibility. Then again, discernment is something that requires a lot of humility, especially discernment of ourselves, as we do our best to understand, did I see a situation clearly? Did I have it correctly? Did I understand what this person was really suggesting I participate in, and so forth? This presentation is based on chapter 21 from the Gospel According to Spiritism, false Christs and false prophets will arise. And among other things, this chapter is really challenging all of us to use our discernment in a variety of ways. So here's a quick outline of what this presentation is going to focus on. We'll focus on the prophet's mission. What is a prophet? A tree is recognized by its fruit. You're probably familiar with this famous saying from Jesus, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on what that implies. Great signs and wonders of false prophets. This is a little bit more of how to identify what certain false prophets might do, especially when it comes to spirit phenomena. Do not believe every spirit. This is a little more aimed at the subject of mediumship. And then there's instructions from the spirits, which in some ways tie things together. In some ways, it's a bit of a return. You may know me from the past that I do love a good excuse to sometimes dive into some historic subjects. And I think in this particular case, it's important to do so, to fully appreciate the warning that Jesus was making about false Christs and false prophets. For instance, the prophet's mission, which is part of chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism, focuses on what is the purpose of being a prophet. I mean, what do we mean when we say someone's a prophet? Well, a prophet is someone who is chosen to receive and transmit the divine word of God. And real prophecy is when all persons are, quote, sent from God with the mission of instructing their fellow human beings and revealing to them the hidden things and the mysteries of spiritual life. Chapter 21 does, in this quote, is also suggesting that prophecy is, yes, the ability to foresee events in the future, to perhaps predict future events, but much more important, prophecy is about teaching, about instructing, about warning. If prophets are listened to, then there's a chance that humanity will benefit and will be actually safer in the long run. But as I'm going to mention very soon, frequently prophets were ignored and not listened to. There's a picture here of Jeremiah. Chapter 21 does make mention of Jeremiah, and we'll get to that as well. In this image, Jeremiah is breaking a pot. The pot is symbolic of the southern kingdom of Judah. Jeremiah was preaching back in about end of the 600s BCE, so a good 600 years before the time of Jesus. Jeremiah is breaking the pot because it symbolizes how bad the country of Judah is. Why? Well, before I get into that, let's take a moment and do a little history. After the time of King David, which was easily about the 10th century BCE, 1,000 years or so before Jesus, King David set up the 12 tribes of Israel, known as the United Kingdom of Israel. It made up what is now present-day Israel, Lebanon, parts of Syria, and Jordan. And if you look at this green territory to the north and the orange territory to the south, or to the below part, what that signifies is what happened to the United Kingdom of Israel. It started to divide. After the death of King Solomon was the son of King David. When Solomon was king, he was king over the entire kingdom of Israel. By the way, Solomon also built the first temple in Jerusalem, what would be the first, it would signify the first temple period. I'll say more about that soon. So King Solomon passed in around 926 BCE, and then there was a split, the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah. The history of this is outlined according to the Bible in Kings 1 and 2, also in Chronicles 1 and 2, but I'm mentioning this because it's also addressed very much by the prophets. The prophets are frequently warning about what is happening in both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. King after king after king down through the centuries were frequently breaking the covenant with God. Judaism introduced monotheism to the world, but after that, many Jews struggled to follow God, to follow a monotheistic God. Paganism was much more tempting. In this time period, the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, they would follow gods like Baal. Baal was a fertility god. And so in order to do that, they would do things like sacrifices. It's been alleged, or it's said in the Bible, that there were actually sacrifices of children, babies, to the god Moloch, who was a fire god. Horrific stuff. But there was also things like sex with temple prostitutes, because this was a way of sort of venerating a fertility god. Now, through the prophets, God is communicating that this is absolutely, totally unacceptable, and that these kingdoms are going to suffer the consequences in a big way. The northern kingdom of Israel would finally be overrun by the Assyrians in 722 BCE, and roughly 150 years later in 526 BCE, the southern kingdom of Judah fell, despite Jeremiah's warnings. But Jeremiah was certainly not the only one. Here's a quick outline of many of the prophets. The prophets are part of what we call the Old Testament. It's really the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh. The Tanakh is slightly different from the Old Testament, but it's essentially, in many ways, the same books and so forth. The prophets started receiving the word of God in roughly the 700s, all the way down to the 400s. Malachi was a minor prophet, the last one, but the main part of it was really the 700s through the 500s. There were the major prophets. There was Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then in those series of books, there's also called the Book of Lamentations, which was probably written by Jeremiah, follows Jeremiah in the Old Testament. And the Book of Lamentations is when Israel did fall in 586 BCE to then the Babylonians. Babylon was then the superpower of that period. And the difference between the major prophets I just mentioned and all of the minor prophets, there were 12 of them, is not necessarily about how profound their message was, but rather the length of the books. Jeremiah is easily 50 plus chapters. Ezekiel is like 65 or so, if I'm not mistaken. And the minor prophets were maybe 5 chapters. The biggest, I think, was 14 chapters and so forth. So that was essentially the difference. But one thing they generally had in common, no matter where they were preaching, most of them were in the south, by the way, in the kingdom of Judah, was don't break the covenant with God. If you break the covenant of God, there's going to be problems. I think from a Spiritist perspective, we could say this is about cause and effect. And this is also related in many ways to the warnings that would come from Jesus, because Jesus was also a prophet. Now, Jeremiah as I mentioned, his ministry was roughly from about the period of 627 to 586 BCE. And there's a mention of Jeremiah in chapter 21, in which Jeremiah would tell the truth to the kings, and the kings didn't always want to hear what he had to say. And so sometimes there were prophets in this period and other periods too, who would tell the kings what they want to hear. So chapter 21 from the gospel mentions what God said to Jeremiah. Do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions from their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. In other words, animism. They say continually to those despite the word of the Lord, it shall be with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster will come upon you. So when the prophets say this, they're saying to the kings of Judah, don't worry. You don't have to worry about the Babylonians. Don't listen to Jeremiah. Everything's fine. You can keep doing paganism all you want. You don't have to worry about this God character, whoever it is. People laughed at Jeremiah. He was put in stocks. They thought he was from the planet Mars, more or less. But at the same time, Jeremiah was speaking the truth. And it would only be a matter of time before the southern kingdom of Judea was overrun in 586 BCE. The Jews were exiled to Babylon. Thousands of them had to leave Jerusalem. There was a protracted conflict in Jerusalem. They were basically starved out. In the Book of Lamentations, which is pretty short, it's a rather vivid description of how bad things were for the kingdom of Judah as it was sort of breathing its last breath, as you were. So Jeremiah lived through the fall of Judah, and Jeremiah was exiled to Babylon along with the others. It's not clear what happened to him after that, but essentially he was correct. And there's an important point to what the prophet's purpose really is, which is, and this is a book, a Jewish book called Jews, God, and History, very readable, and it mentions the following, that the prophet was above the seer and above the priest because the Jewish people implicitly believed that their prophets were men sent by God to show man the path of righteousness. The prophet in Jewish history was concerned with preserving the purity of the Jewish religion. This led him to the field of man's moral corruption and to the ideas that the Jews, who were the chosen people of God, must set an example for the rest of mankind, humankind, if you will. Book's about 60 plus years old. So anyway, part of the message here. Why did the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah have problems? Well, they were ignoring the warnings of the prophets. There was a lot of pride. People didn't want to change. They didn't think it was a problem, what they were doing, even though the prophets were saying over and over and over and over again, don't follow Baal, don't engage in these abominable acts as they're described. The language in the books of the prophets can often be harsh and kind of punitive sounding. I think from a Spiritist perspective, we can understand it as cause and effect. Because when people were worshiping, say, Baal or multiple gods, they were basically human inventions. It wasn't the God. And so there was this ongoing struggle down through the centuries from King David all the way to the fall of Judah, that of this, some kings might follow God for a while, but then others who succeeded would not. And so it was an ongoing, struggle to be truthful to God, to actually respect and venerate God. So the southern kingdom of Judah, after it fell in 586 BCE, the Jews were exiled for about 50 years, and then they were allowed to come back. The northern kingdom of Israel never came back, so that was gone forever. But the southern kingdom of Israel did come back. The second temple would be built a few years later, roughly 516 BCE, and it would continue until we get to the time of Jesus. I'll say more about that soon. A tree is recognized by its fruit. Another section in chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism. This is, of course, a warning by Jesus. Jesus is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. He's in front of a large crowd. And at one point, he warns the crowd, or he says to the crowd, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." This is simple, straightforward language that farmers would easily understand, and yet this is also full of meaning. What we have to pay attention not to what people say as much as what people actually do. That's how character is really revealed. So a healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree can bear good fruit. I'm going to guess you've all heard this one before. It's basically saying, do our best to understand what somebody does and what kind of fruit do they really produce. It's both profound, it's also a little haunting. Any of us could ask ourselves, gee, what kind of fruit do I produce? Do I produce anything worthwhile? We hope so, of course, but if we don't, then the idea that a tree is cut down and thrown into the fire can be a reference to reincarnation, a chance to start over again. Just as God gave the Hebrews a chance to start over, even though king after king after king frequently didn't follow God during the first temple period that I mentioned. So Jesus is warning this great crowd about a tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Now, privately, a little bit later on, and this is, I'm going to focus mainly on the book of Matthew, but it's mentioned in Mark too. Privately, when Jesus is with the disciples, he warns them about their future and about the future period. This is around the chapter 24 of Matthew, near the beginning, and a little bit before that too. It's really a commentary about signs of the end of the age. Jesus says to them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will increase, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved." There's lots one can say about this. I find it interesting and informative to not only look at a quote like this, which is near the beginning, a few lines into chapter 24, but I think it's useful to look at what was happening around this whole section of Matthew. So look at chapter 23, chapter 25 a little bit, and that sort of thing. What do I mean by that? Well, if we go back in chapter 23 a little bit before, Jesus starts to lament about Jerusalem. There are lamentations from Jesus and warnings. For instance, Jesus laments that Jerusalem is the city that, quote, kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. He then says, "How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." How many times did God try to help the Hebrews? How many times did the prophets try to help their communities and they were ignored? Is Jesus trying to help his community? Yes. Jerusalem is a city with a long and troubled history. Jesus is hinting about that. It says Jerusalem kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. Was he talking about himself? Yeah. But he also says stones those who are sent to it. It's most likely that Jesus was referring to a prophet named Zechariah. Zechariah was a prophet in the, I believe it's the 800s. He's mentioned in 2nd Chronicles. Remember I mentioned that Chronicles 1 and 2 is another retelling of the history of the first temple period, along with Kings 1 and 2 and so forth. There's a moment where this young prophet is murdered in Jerusalem because he's warning the king about transgressing against God. The king didn't like it, so the king had him murdered by stoning. And he died somewhere between the altar and the sanctuary. So there's a hint that he probably died at the temple itself or very close to it. And Jesus is probably referring to Zechariah. Now, Jesus, if we go a little bit earlier than that quote from Jesus about that he's warning to the disciples, before he mentions Zechariah in chapter 23, really just a few verses before, Jesus says to the scribes and Pharisees, he's really letting them have it, basically. He calls them vipers. He calls them, basically a bunch of hypocrites. He really challenges them. And he also makes a reference that you witness against yourselves that you are the sons of those who murdered the prophets. So again, there's another mention here about the prophets being murdered, and that the Pharisees are just the latest group that are following a long honored, well, honored is not the right word, I'm being facetious, but it's a long tradition of persecuting the prophets because the prophets were trying to tell the truth. So Jesus, in this section, Matthew chapter 23, 24, 25, and all that, this is soon before Jesus is going to be betrayed by Judas and get arrested. So in some ways, Jesus is getting ready for that. He's also trying to make the most of the time that he has left. So he challenges the Pharisees. But also in Matthew chapter 24, if we go back to the early part of 24, that kicks off that commentary about the signs of the end of the age, after Jesus really challenges the Pharisees, they go out of the temple, and Jesus's followers, the disciples, admire the second temple, which had been, I mentioned, it was rebuilt in, it was built in 516 BCE. And then about 20 years or so before Jesus was born, roughly 20 BCE, give or take, Herod the Great did a major expansion of the second temple. So it became this really extravagant place. The second temple was the heart of Jewish worship, Jewish religion. It was a pilgrimage site. People came from all over to the second temple. When Jesus gets arrested during the time of Passover, many people have come into Jerusalem to commemorate Passover. And they would go to this temple to commemorate the event, the celebration. Now, as Jesus and the disciples are leaving the second temple after Jesus confronts the Pharisees, the disciples are admiring how beautiful the temple is. It's getting a new facelift and all that. And then Jesus predicts, I tell you the truth, there will not be one stone of this place left. Was Jesus engaging in a little prophecy? Yes, he was. He was also sending a huge warning. In what way? Well, first of all, Jesus said that the temple was not going to last. Jesus was probably crucified around 30 BCE, maybe 30 AD, maybe 33 AD, somewhere in there. The second temple, this temple, there's a model of it here, was destroyed in 70 AD. Why? The Jewish revolt, which started in 66 AD. Jesus is warning his disciples, we are in very turbulent times. And it was. There were the four major Jewish sects. The Pharisees, you're probably familiar with, there were the Sadducees. They were both part of the elite. The Sanhedrin, the 70-member council that condemned Jesus to be crucified, was made up of members of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There was also the Essenes. They were out in the desert. They were removed from the inner workings of Jerusalem. They wanted nothing to do with the other sects, basically. The Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the late 1940s were from the Essenes. Then there was the fourth major sect, which was the Zealots. They were the radicals. They were the ones that really couldn't stand being under Roman rule, and they were advocating for revolt. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, the revolt of 66 AD was started generally by a couple of things. Inept Roman rule locally. The Roman Empire was at the zenith of its power during the time of Jesus, before and after, but it was also politically rather turbulent. In this period of the 40s, 50s, 60s, especially in the 60s, there were multiple emperors. Two of the craziest emperors in Rome's history, Caligula and Nero, were within just a few years of each other. And there was one period where there were 4 emperors in a very, very short period of time. So things were chaotic. Meanwhile, the Romans didn't treat the Jews very well. On the one hand, they allowed them to practice their religion as long as they paid taxes and swore allegiance to Rome, which was both religiously and politically difficult. The Zealots, who I mentioned, the major radicals of the 4 Jewish sects, their attitude was we would rather die than live under Roman rule. So they played a big role in instigating the rebellion. The Pharisees were not in favor of having a rebellion, but it happened anyway. And when Jesus is outside the temple, and he just predicts that the temple's not going to stand, he also says some other things to the prophets. He basically mentions Daniel. Daniel, you remember, is a major prophet. There's the book of Daniel. Daniel was around the same time as Jeremiah. His ministry was roughly 60 years. He started in Jerusalem, but since he was exiled to Babylon, he was mainly in Babylon. At times, Daniel gave interpretations of king's dreams, and so he was in favor. He was on good terms with the kings, but as different kings came along, sometimes Daniel gave prophecies, because he tried to tell the truth, that they didn't like. At one point, Daniel's put into this place with lions, but Daniel's protected by God. The lions don't touch Daniel. But those who falsely accused Daniel, they were given up to the lions. So things like that. Now, Jesus mentions Daniel. Why? Because Daniel is talking about the age of desolation, and he makes reference to a temple being destroyed. And Jesus is basically outlining that the second temple and that we're in a turbulent period. And at one point, Jesus mentions, as he's warning the disciples, again, this is near the beginning of chapter 24 in Matthew, he's warning them that times are going to be unstable. He says those who are in Judah should run for the hills, so to speak. They should go to the mountains. They should get out of there. Apparently, 37, almost 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, apparently some people did remember what Jesus warned, and they left. Because the 66 AD, when the Jewish revolt started, to 70 AD, when it was finally crushed, it was a very violent period. A lot of people were killed. The Romans had no problem being very repressive and very brutal. They killed a lot of people. But then the Zealots, if they would target people who were either friendly Jewish fellow Jews who were friendly to Rome, or even Roman citizens, and they would kill them. So there was a lot of bloodshed on both sides. When Jesus warns about false prophets, it means many things. But one thing I'd like to suggest to all of you, the idea that the Hebrews, who understandably detested Rome, some of them did at least, the idea that they could somehow defeat Rome and somehow separate and be their own country and keep Jerusalem to themselves and all that, absolutely not. I would say that was complete folly. Nobody was going to defeat Rome in this period. Was it a type of false prophets, as it were, who were maybe able to convince people, yeah, we can take on Rome, sure, we're going to do this. These were the fanatics, the zealots. And again, it's more complicated than the way I'm outlining it. But if Josephus, the Jewish historian, is correct, and he lived through this period, by the way, if he was correct in saying that that the zealots were really pushing for this, when people listen to fanatics, radicals, sometimes it can be a type of false prophecy because they may want to take everyone down a rabbit hole that nobody can really get out of. Great signs and wonders of false prophets, another section in chapter 21 of the Gospel according to Spiritism. Going back to now this is in Mark chapter 13, Jesus says false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Okay, here chapter 21 shifts its focus a little bit. It's starting to touch a little bit more on the way sometimes individuals can be charismatic, very persuasive. Maybe they have a lot of magnetic energy, and they may try to manipulate phenomena and come across like they've got these exceptional powers. But in chapter 21 and many other parts of the Spiritist codification, there are warnings not to fall for this stuff. First of all, chapter 21 points out that God does not give perverse beings a power equal to its own. So no matter how powerful some may be, a ruler, king, a group of people, tyrants, you name it, they do not have the same power as God. Or say just charismatic individuals who can manipulate phenomena in such a way and be persuasive. Therefore, the other point made is that the circle of supernatural facts narrows as the circle of science broadens. The Spiritist codification, as you know, was produced in the late 1850s into the 1860s. It's the age of reason. There's more, the presence of science is growing more and more. Modern science really started in the early 1600s. And so by the time we get to the era of Kardec, there's more and more emphasis that science, as one important form of knowledge, we should use it to do away with so-called supernatural events and things like that. So it's quite likely that in Kardec's day and before, people were very more easily fooled by the manipulation of physical phenomena of one kind or another. And this is another type of false prophecy. Again, people not knowing any better, perhaps they could be excused for that, but suspending their discernment, or they simply just didn't know. So they were preyed upon in that way. There's an emphasis in chapter 21 that the dissemination of scientific knowledge kills the credibility of false prophets. Again, we're being invited to use our discernment. Another section is do not believe every spirit. This part of chapter 21 from the Gospel according to Spiritism is more of the focus is a little bit more on mediumship in certain ways. I'll show you what I mean. First of all, do not believe every spirit is a reference to the first letter of John. The first letter of John is near the end of the New Testament. It might have been written by the John the Apostle. Some say John the Evangelist. There's not absolute certainty, but there's reason to believe that maybe John the Apostle might have written this in the 80s of the first century. In other words, almost 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. John was the only disciple, apostle, to live to old age. All the others were most likely martyred. He probably passed sometime in the 90s AD. By the way, the 90s, for what it's worth, if you're interested in this stuff, was when the Zealots, who I mentioned before, were in a major standoff with the Romans at Masada. Masada is a historic site. You can visit it if you ever get to go to Israel. I won't get into that. But anyway, so it was around the same time period. So John wrote this letter. It's a relatively short letter. And part of the reason it was written is that there were some very weird understandings about who Jesus was, what Christianity is. And so he was trying to clarify some things. And he says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. But you know the Spirit of God. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God." So those who deny Jesus would not be from God. If you're familiar with the books of Emmanuel, mainly there's first 2,000 years ago, but more, this surfaces a lot in the book 50 years later, and also the book Paul and Stephen, which we happen to be reading at our center right now. There's a lot of individuals who don't take Jesus seriously, especially in the Jewish community. Many did believe in Jewish, but those who didn't thought, this Nazareth guy, from the boonies, this carpenter, what does he know? There was this very dismissive attitude to Jesus. But John, in the first letter of John, is emphasizing that that's someone who's not from God. It's really kind of a comment about don't follow those kinds of prophets, as it were. Now, he says, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. This gets produced a lot in conversations about mediumship, the medium's book, for instance, and so forth. And in chapter 21, it's mentioned that Spiritism really emphasized that there is another type of false Christs and false prophets who can be even more dangerous than the incarnate ones, and that is the discarnate ones. Discarnate spirits who are deceptive, hypocritical, proud, falsely sage individuals, and so forth. You know, probably the well-known question in the Spirits book 459, I believe it is, that the question is, do spirits influence our thoughts? And the answer is more than you might think. So if that's, with that as a premise, then how often are we given hints, suggestions, and so forth by spirits that do not have our best interests in heart? So there's a warning here that we always have to use our discernment, even when our friends on the other side are unbalanced, misguided, angry friends who may want to cause problems, even when they are trying to suggest things to us. I mentioned before that the Jewish revolt is just one of many examples one could use in history, or even now, where people are stirred up, fired up, and want to go in certain directions that may be very destructive. Yes, they may be encouraged by false prophets, but another way to understand it is there's a massive amount of obsession going on. And that's part of what this is talking about. Okay, so instructions from the spirits, in other words, how to recognize genuine versus false prophets. Well, first of all, beware of those who claim to have an exclusive monopoly on truth. Truth usually surfaces in a variety of different ways in a variety of different places. The book of Genesis mentions this, for instance. So you always have to be careful of anyone who insists that only they are the one, so to speak. And remember that each and every created being bears on its forehead, but all of its deeds, the stamp of its greatness or decadence. Again, what Jesus said, you can tell a tree by the fruit it produces, if it's a healthy tree or an unhealthy tree. Also, it's important to keep in mind, Jesus mentioned, or when he was warning his prophets, which I talked about before, he was saying the times are going to be turbulent and it's necessary. Often humanity is going through periods of transition. And when that happens, there's often no shortage of schemers and people who want to pretend they're reformers. I have the answer, don't worry, or people who pass themselves off as messiahs. Now, you don't have to necessarily be religious to fall into this category, but I think you get the idea that anytime there's a period of transition, often there's uncertainty, times can be chaotic, and so forth. Also, chapter 21 emphasizes that God entrusts important missions only to those it knows are capable. So in order to morally and intellectually advance humanity, we need people of superior intelligence and morality. Sometimes people have a lot of intelligence. We live in a period now where there's a lot of intelligence. How much morality is there? Well, in some ways there's a lot, but then again, sometimes people really are very intelligent, their morality needs work, shall we say. But what this is saying is that someone who is a genuine prophet, as it were, someone to follow, is somebody who's got more of a healthy balance of both morality and intelligence. Also, true missionaries of God must justify their mission through their superiority, through their virtues, through greatness, and by the result and moralizing influence of their deeds. Kind of a continuation of the point I was just making, that it's very important that people act with disinterest. If people really want to help humanity, want to lead a country or a group of people, whatever it is, genuine leaders don't have a hidden agenda, so to speak, except to try to be of help and service to God. They're not operating with the what's in it for me mentality. So, false prophets in the errant state. There are plenty of them in the spirit world, so we always have to pay attention to what we may be attracting. Often they are proud and they show pretenses of love and charity. They love disunity. They love to delay progress. They are the ones who sow seeds of antagonism among groups, causing them to isolate themselves from one another and to see one another in a bad light. Those who capitalize and traffic on this are certainly examples of false prophets. And chapter 21, very importantly tells us that enough should be a clear warning sign to that this should be exposed. But he also is saying, look, blind are those who let themselves fall into such a crude trap. So we have to do our part. As I mentioned at the beginning, and I think it's worth repeating more than once, we have to do our part and use our own discernment. Genuine spirits from the higher order must not only be kind, but eminently rational. They're not expounding weird utopian ideas that are really not practical, and certainly they should not be advocating something that contradicts science in profound ways. Okay? If they are, they're lying, ignorant spirits. Truth will eventually prevail among the majority. There's another comment in chapter 21 that basically says that truth is like the sun. It will dissipate the fog. Truth is sustainable, and it's not just a convenient way to behave. It's like love. It's the natural state of things. Truth will always win out in the end. Even if we're in a period where people are trafficking in falsehoods right and left and distortions and all that, wait. Truth will eventually prevail among the majority. This is part of what it means to have our faith and our trust in God. It then goes on to say it makes little sense that any belief system that sees its adherents diminish is somehow truer than a system that multiplies followers. That's another sign to look for. If a movement is happening, is it gaining followers? Okay, maybe for a while it does, but then does it last? What's going to happen over time? And at the end of the day, God wants truth to happen for all, not to a small, select group. Again, we're not talking elitism here, not a few high priests who are going to bestow their wisdom and their knowledge upon everyone else. That goes for Spiritism, of course. Spiritists are blessed in many ways with wonderful knowledge, but we don't have a monopoly on truth. We never did. And this kinds of truths will surface in a variety of ways in many different places, in many different cultures with different belief systems, and so forth. Again, part of this last part of the section, advice from the spirits, does make comments about spirit communications, and this one is really a good mediumship practice for mediumistic meetings, which is that all spirit communications must be submitted to reason and logic, or logical, that it's always possible that an individual medium might become fascinated, and perhaps the whole group of people along with them will be fascinated and therefore misled. And so people have to be on their guard and be careful about these things. So to wrap up, just want to say a few things real quick. There's a nice quote from chapter 21 that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is warning us to use our discernment. We have to do what we can to the best of our ability to distinguish between good and bad spirits so that we don't become false prophets ourselves. Even if we're not trying to persuade a large group of people, you might say that if we're following along a bunch of fallacies and we're trying to convince our neighbors or our family members, yeah, this is right, you're wrong for thinking what you think, maybe we're being false prophets on a very local, minor level, but still we're participating. It really raises the question for all of us. To whom and to what are we attuned with? Do we pay attention to this on a regular basis? We always need to be careful and vigilant and observant. Anyone in a position of power who lies and misleads bears responsibility for being a, quote, false prophet. Pretty straightforward. But as I've been hinting at all along, if we choose to suspend our discernment, we are also responsible. And Jesus emphasized that we need to have the emotional strength to get through periods of lawlessness, hardships, and despair. And it may be a time where you feel like the false prophets are winning, they have too much power, things are not good, we're going, down a shaky road, rocky road, and all that. But these things don't last forever, even if in the short run it's very turbulent. Jesus was warning the prophets, I mentioned before, as they were leaving the Second Temple. Not only is the Second Temple not going to last, but the times are going to be turbulent. You all are going to have a very difficult time of it. The lawlessness is going to increase, and it did. But it's important that we hang in there. We're always frequently, maybe not frequently, but often, we're in periods where many are proud and stubborn. It can be incredibly frustrating to experience this. Jesus was betrayed by the proud and the stubborn, among other things. And yet, he also says to his apostles and to all of us, the one who endures to the end will be saved. So no matter how turbulent things get, no matter how discouraged or angry or frustrated we may get, the one who endures to the end will be saved. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for this wonderful presentation. Anyone want to ask any questions or has any comments for the presenter? I know that we still have a couple of minutes left, but the floor is open.
Hi, Peter. My name is Beth. Thank you so much for this lecture. Just some advice. So obviously it's very turbulent times around the globe right now. And so as we are enduring, what is your advice on, or what from your readings, how are we enduring? Like, what does it
mean to endure?
What does it mean? Right.
I think we have to do our best to keep our equilibrium. That we have to be truthful to our higher selves. Don't get caught up in the fray. Don't become argumentative. Let's assume for a moment that I assume when I say psychosphere, you all are familiar with this idea that the collective energies around us can be very turbulent. Well, it can sometimes be hard not to get provoked in different ways, but we have to do our best, even if we do have moments where we perhaps do get caught up in something that we wish we hadn't. Can we bring ourselves back, recalibrate ourselves, and do our best to, again, really connect to our higher selves as much as possible. You know, I don't think I could begin to advise each and every one of you individually how you should do that for yourselves, because you process things in your own way. But all of us, again, have to ask ourselves, what provokes me? Where are my weaknesses? And how can I develop enough consciousness, in the ways that Joanna de Angelis advises a great deal, to not get sucked in to turbulent periods. And if things do become worse, obviously we hope they don't, but if they do, are we able to handle that? Can we adapt to the unexpected? And even if we're in moments of shock, sometimes things will happen and we're caught off guard, and we have to do our best to, try to allow ourselves a chance to process what's going on and then figure out what to do. Some of that also is a function of one's personality. If you're the more impulsive type, it may be hard to do those things right away. But as time goes on, in the way that truth will prevail, so can reason, so to speak, that we all are blessed and equipped with having the ability to use our discernment, use our consciousness. We need to read the gospel more often to calm us down and things like that. Then yes, do all those things and much more, of course. And naturally, we should seek out the help of one another and rely upon the strength of our community.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Mhm.
Any other questions, any other comments?
Just to say thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
And Peter, I think I really like that you close the presentation with that reminder that we usually think about the false prophets as being someone on the outside, right?
Mhm.
But being for ourselves, to mind what we are communicating to others, to be very stricter with us than we are with others, so that we don't fall into the trap of becoming the false prophets ourselves.
Right.
I think it's today, especially in this current environment that we're living, like this time of transition, with all that information going around very easily in social media, that is very easy for us to, most of the times, inadvertently, to wear that cape of the false prophet.
Mhm.
So thank you for reminding all of us of that.
Yeah, that's a reminder that whatever resources we use to get our information, it's always good to look at different resources, different points of view, try to put together an understanding for ourselves. Try to verify if we can. I know sometimes that's not easy, but try to pick sources of information that are trustworthy to begin with.
Anybody else? Adriana, Anna, Camila, I see. Mary, Cristiane, Tatiana, João,
I just
Marga.
want to say thank you. Thank you, Peter, once again for being here with us for this awesome presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Adriana. Appreciate it.
It was great.
Thank you for having me.
And Peter, can I then invite you to do our closing prayer?
Yes, yeah, I can do one.
Actually, Peter, I just want to, I don't know if you told about, and what the Imperium, who destroyed the second temple? I
Oh, who
forgot.
destroyed it? The Romans did. Yeah, I didn't make that clear. The Romans put down the revolution, the Jewish revolt that was going on for almost 4 years, and then they completely destroyed the Second Temple. And it was a major period in Jewish history because after that, it began the diaspora. Judaism the focal point used to be Jerusalem, and then it started to spread out. The Sanhedrin that I mentioned, the 70-member council that condemned Jesus, they pretty much were gone after that. They didn't last. The Sadducees didn't last too much longer after that, but the Pharisees continued. And actually, the rabbinical tradition in Judaism is a continuation of the Pharisaic tradition in many positive ways. It's not like the Pharisees are always a bunch of bad guys. I don't think that's fair. But the end of that period and the way the religion was practiced did change as a result of that moment. So Judaism changed significantly after that.
Yeah.
But again, the Romans put it down, and there were additional revolts between the Hebrews and the Romans. Some others said it would occur like over the next century or so. So in some ways, it's like an example of Jewish nationalism. You could interpret it that way, that they simply weren't going to tolerate Rome's disrespect of them and their belief system, and that attitude of, if you attack us, we're going to fight back, kind of thing. One thing I didn't mention that Jesus, you may remember, was tested at one point where he was asked, so what's your stand on taxation? Should we be paying taxes to Rome? And Jesus says, why do you test me about this? And he says, can I see a coin? So he looks at a Roman coin, sees Caesar on there, and he holds it up and says, who is this? And they say, Caesar. And he says, well, give to Caesar's what is due to Caesar, and give to God what is due to God. So Jesus, I don't think, would have advocated trying to fight the Romans head on like that. That does not, so it's a complicated question, but sometimes people make these kinds of decisions and they have all kinds of outcomes. Would they have been better off if they had been more conciliatory and tolerated it? Well, maybe. But at the same time, I think probably many people would have, but there were some that just found it intolerable. They couldn't, they didn't want to accept Rome.
Thank you. So many histories.
Okay. So Peter, could you do a closing prayer for us?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Dear God, thank you for being with us. We thank you for always being with us. And may we do our best to be with you. May we be present in everything that we experience. May we have the courage to face everything that we go through, the different trials, the different expiations. May we do our best to learn. May we do our best to be as thoughtful and mindful as possible each and every day. Thank you for giving us the gift of discernment, the gift of knowledge, the gift of a variety of emotions, the capacity for love and compassion. And may we put this and much more into practice. Amen.
Amen. So good. Thank you once again, Peter, for bringing all this knowledge to us.